Well, welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in a group discussion on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is March 3, 2024, and I'm your host, James Myers. It's an honor to welcome in discussion members of the Toronto, Calgary, and Chicago Philosophy Meetup groups. Whether you've been with us before or are here for the first time, whether you have experience with or are new to Plato's works, I encourage you to add your voice to our dialogue. This is the fourth session of our extended series on Plato's longest dialogue, The Laws, and today we'll be starting at 633d to finish the examination of Book I that began 2 weeks ago. Then we ended with the unnamed Athenian, Clinias from Crete, and Megillus from Sparta, who had just finished discussing the importance of education and virtue for the youth of Magnesia, the new colony that Crete is founding with Clinias in its leadership. Our first reading today will introduce the themes of courage, pain, pleasure, and self-control, which are to be central in a constitution for Magnesia that cultivates virtue among its citizens with the goal of peace. So as always, to contribute your thoughts to our discussion today, please use the raise hands feature in Zoom, and for everyone's benefit, please relate your comments and opinions to Plato's text. So that everyone has a chance to speak, I'll call on you in the order that hands are raised, using first name only. Once we finish recording in 2 hours, I invite anyone who wishes to remain online for Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. 2 weeks ago, we ended with a reading from 643b to 644b, in which the Athenian called for, quote, education from childhood in virtue, a training which produces a keen desire to become a perfect citizen who knows how to rule and be ruled as justice demands, unquote. This led us to a discussion whether it would be better to teach knowledge rather than virtue, and to a statement that Plato equated virtue with knowledge in his short dialogue, the Meno. So virtue being essential to Magnesia's constitution, after listening to the podcast of our last discussion, I reread the Meno, which was my introduction 8 or 9 years ago to Plato's dialogues. The premise of the Meno is the question whether virtue can be taught, and in their dialogue, the characters Socrates, Meno, and Antaeus assert that if virtue is teachable, there are none qualified to teach it, not even the renowned sophists Protagoras and Gorgias. Socrates says in the concluding lines, before he hurries away, no doubt with the answer to his own question, it follows from this reasoning, Meno, that virtue appears to be present in those of us who may possess it as a gift from the gods. We shall have clear knowledge of this when, before we investigate how it comes to be present in men, we first try to find out what virtue in itself is. But now the time has come for me to go. So what struck me here in relation to both books 1 and 10 of the Laws is Socrates' word reasoning, which we learn from Book 10 is the powerful capacity at the core of the universe that's accessible to the human soul. When Socrates said that virtue is a gift from the gods, and the Athenian equated the gods with reason in Book 10 of the Laws, is it the case that virtue is a harmonious derivative of reason, being supreme and in the soul's power of persuasion? If that's the case, then are we persuaded by the Athenian, Clinias, and Megillus that a constitution that instills virtue in its citizens for the immaterial good is more peaceful and enduring than a constitution that prepares for war and protection of material goods? So if virtue is not knowledge itself, but is rooted in knowledge, then how do we find the root? In fact, in the Meno, Socrates states that all knowledge is recollection, and recollection is the account of the reasons why. He says this, and by implication that knowledge is the account of the order of cause and effect in time, at Meno 97c to 98a. Referring to statues made by Daedalus that appear so lifelike they might run away, Socrates states, to acquire an untied work of Daedalus is not worth much, like acquiring a runaway slave, for it does not remain, but it is worth much if tied down, for his works are very beautiful. What am I thinking of when I say this? True opinions. For true opinions, as long as they remain, are a fine thing, and all they do is good. But they are not willing to remain long, and they escape from a man's mind, so that they are not worth much until one ties them down by giving an account of the reasons why. And that, Meno, my friend, is recollection, as we previously agreed. So if virtue and knowledge alike are rooted in reason, which Book 10 says is the cause and logical core of the universe, then the subject of today's first reading might help us to find virtue's root. I'll read now the passages from 633d to 634c, which discuss the role of courage in conquering both pain and pleasure so that neither of them will shield us from the light of reason. Right, so this is 633d to 634c. The Athenian starts. You've put it all very well, my Spartan friend. But what is to be our definition of courage? Are we to define it simply in terms of a fight against fears and pains only? Or do we include desires and pleasures, which cajole and seduce us so effectively? They mold the heart like wax, even the hearts of those who loftily believe themselves superior to such influences. Megillus responds, Yes, I think so. The fight is against all these feelings. The Athenian continues, Now, if we remember aright what was said earlier on, our friend from Kenosis spoke of a city and an individual as conquered by themselves. Isn't that right? Clinias affirms, Surely. Well, shall we call bad only the man who is conquered by pains, or shall we include the victims of pleasures as well? Clinias answers, The term bad we apply, I think, to the victim of pleasures even more than to the other. When we say that a man has become shamefully conquered by himself, we are all, I fancy, much more likely to mean someone defeated by pleasures than by pains. The Athenian continues, But the legal code of those lawgivers, inspired as they are by Zeus and Apollo, certainly did not envisage a courage with one hand tied behind its back, able to hit out on the left, but powerless in face of the cunning and seductive blandishments from the right. Surely it was supposed to resist in both directions. Yes, both, I think, Clinias says. Well, the Athenian continues, we ought to mention next what practices exist in your two cities that give a man a taste of pleasure rather than teach him how to avoid it. You remember how a man could not avoid pains, but was surrounded by them, and then forced or persuaded by awards of honor to get the better of them. Now, where in your codes of law is the institution that does the same for pleasure? Could you say, please, what institution you have that makes one and the same body of citizens courageous in face of pains and pleasures alike, so that they conquer where they ought to conquer and never fall victims to these, their most intimate and dangerous enemies? So I wanted to start with that reading just to get the idea of fear, pain, pleasure, courage, all of these sort of on the table, because I think this speaks to what they're trying to do with the Constitution of Magnesia and in terms of trying to instill virtue in the citizens. And I wonder if there's any thoughts about this particular passage in terms of what it says, particularly about pleasures and conquering pleasures. Is this something that is relevant today? Is this an issue today? How is pleasure dealt with in our Constitution? Our constitutions, much less the constitutions of Crete, which is where Clinias is from, and Sparta, which is where Megillus is from. Any thoughts on that? I wonder if pleasure is something that we seek, but something that we define maybe differently over time. And I'm just thinking in particular about these quotes that I have on the first page of the notes here on the screen. And in particular, the word happiness. So we might think now of happiness as private pleasure, but in this quote, this is an excerpt from an article called "The Founder's Antidote to Demagoguery as a Lesson for Today" by Jeffrey Rosen. It was published in the Washington Post on February 20th, and he quotes some of the founders or the framers of the U.S. Constitution. There's some pretty interesting quotes here in terms of how they saw maybe pleasure and happiness back then, maybe 250 years ago, versus the way we see them today. And maybe I'll just read a few of these brief ones here. Alexander Hamilton, the first quote is, When a man unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, bold in his temper, is seen to mount the hobby horse of popularity, it may justly be suspected that his object is to throw things into confusion, that he may ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. Kind of maybe rings a little bit of situation today that's happening, maybe. Or there's Thomas Jefferson. If once elected, and at a second or third election outvoted by one or two votes, he will pretend false votes, foul play, hold possession of the reins of government, be supported by the states voting for him. That was Thomas Jefferson writing to James Madison in 1787. James Madison said, I go on this great Republican principle that the people will have virtue and intelligence to select men of virtue and wisdom. He continued, Is there no virtue among us? If there be not, we are in a wretched situation. No theoretical checks, no form of government can render us secure. So I'll just read this bit. The writer of the article said the founders believed that virtuous self mastery was necessary for both personal and political happiness. Today, we think of happiness as the pursuit of pleasure, but classical and Enlightenment thinkers defined happiness as a pursuit of virtue, as being good rather than feeling good. George Washington made the connection between public and private virtue and happiness repeatedly in his career. Quote, virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government, unquote, he warned in his farewell address. In his circular to the states in 1783, he said that four things were necessary for the people's political and social happiness: an indissoluble union, a sacred regard to public justice, a proper peace establishment, and the cultivation of private virtue, which he defined as, quote, the prevalence of that pacific and friendly disposition among the people of the United States which will induce them to forget their local prejudices and policies and to sacrifice their individual advantages to the interest of the community. So I thought I would read that just because this idea in the laws of framing a constitution with a view to cultivating virtue is maybe not such a radical suggestion. It seems to have been present in a lot of what was said in that part that I just read from the founders of the US Constitution. So, what are your thoughts, Darren?
Hi everyone. So regarding this um training and how to deal with pleasure, I think the context here was a little bit interesting because it was in the context of Megillus's discussion or view that they've dealt with pleasures in Sparta by basically completely eliminating them, which includes drinking parties. So there's like a subtle difference in a view of what virtue might mean for a person and also for a community. So in Sparta, the Athenian actually seems to be, implicitly critiquing Sparta here in that they just have a kind of semblance of virtue in that they've just sort of very, very aggressively and maybe what's the word? Um like they forcefully eliminated it. That's what I was looking for. Which actually ties in with last week's discussion. We discussed a lot about force versus ideals. But anyway, they very forcefully eliminated it. But so here he's the Athenian is suggesting an alternative view of what virtue might be like. I think at both an individual level and a state level. So it's not one where it's been forcefully removed or from view in a way, but it's where people um have been trained in it, have been exposed to it, and know how to deal with it, in a virtuous way. So I think that's the context here is a little bit interesting in how we might see, it might even have implications for how we should understand the cultivation of virtue in both individuals and communities today. This one approach being sort of very interventionist and forceful, whereas another one, which is I think more about persuasion and education. And I just want to point out one more thing quickly, which is that so we're going to find out in short order, right, that one of these ways to train in virtue is through precisely the thing that Sparta has, completely outlawed, which is drinking and drinking parties. So Athenian actually finds some utility for it. So again, there's a way in which it's a subtle critique of the Spartan and Spartan institutions and maybe how severe they are. And I think this is interesting. Like, it's interesting that Plato utilizes this so-called institution of drinking parties to um to demonstrate a lot of things. And I think some of this will unroll maybe in the conversation today. But the thing I want to like highlight at the moment is that there's something very similar here to what happens in a lot of the other virtue dialogues with the featuring Socrates about all the various virtues, and how in all those dialogues, yeah, basically all of them, there's an idea that none of the virtues are good or bad in and of themselves, except insofar as they're directed towards the good. So there's nothing inherently good or bad in anywhere in the world, except insofar as they're directed towards the good.
Yeah.
And here there's an idea about this institution as well. Like, we shouldn't see drinking or drinking parties as like inherently good or bad. It just depends on how they're shaped and molded and what place they have in our society and how they can be directed to the good. So I think it's interesting that this kind of approach is also applied here, but to institutions instead of
Mhm.
virtue,
Mhm.
instead of the virtues. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and we will get to that interesting part about the drinking parties, which the Athenian proposes as something that maybe should be undertaken to as kind of a measure of each other. I think he's suggesting. So I have a selection of a few readings on that, and I do have, you mentioned the Cretan constitution and the Spartan constitution were both designed to banish pleasure, basically, especially the one in Sparta. And so I think here, and we'll see in the next reading that I have, they're going to talk about maybe that's not such a good idea to banish it. Maybe we should be training people, I think is what he's setting up here to say, is we should be training people to deal with pleasure and to conquer their to conquer pleasure in terms of being able to control it, and self-control will be the second major topic that I wanted to discuss today. So thank you for that. And we'll go to Brian. Welcome, Brian.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, I have many thoughts, so I'll try to keep it to a couple. What's interesting to me here is that in this dialogue, we're talking about training the citizen, I believe. Whereas in the Republic, they talked about training the guardians to become rulers. In both dialogues, they do talk about working with pleasure. And that's actually in the Republic like a test. Like, well, you have the spirited ones, but will they succumb to pleasure? Because the concern there was that they'll become greedy and abuse their power. There's something similar here, and actually goes with what you read from the American context of being virtuous in the sense of self-rule, I believe, where it matters to have a public that could rule themselves. Not really for the abuse of power necessarily, but maybe so. I mean, as they become future leaders or take on responsibilities. Another thing that was interesting to me is we admit pleasure as something to be tamed, as opposed to pretending that virtue would be not to have that pleasure in the first place and to have a desire for something better, which maybe in the ultimate sense, you want the good instead of appetites. But in the first place, you have to tame the non-rational soul and to know yourself so that you could know the good ultimately. Maybe that is the ruler's training to know the good. But I think that's interesting to admit it rather than like what Darren said about Spartans maybe sort of denying a sort of self-denial. And the other data point I have is the statesman, which again in the statesman dialogue, that isn't about the citizen. That is about weaving courage and temperance. There's that idea of weaving and how that is what will um well they're actually there they are talking about weaving the virtues to make a better populace. And so I could foresee that happening here because we're talking about courage in this in a way that looks like self-restraint. So I'm really curious about how we
Mhm.
talk about that as we go forward.
Well, those are great points. Thank you, Brian. It's and certainly we see here, or we'll see courage being developed as a bit of a tricky virtue because it can be used in a good way and a way that's not so good. So I like the idea of weaving. I think that you talked about that it has to weave into the context to be appropriate. So one has to be courageous in conquering one's pleasures as well as being courageous in conquering one's pains. So it's an important point. And I like the way you brought up the guardians from the Republic because there are guardians in this dialogue as well. And we'll see those introduced, I think, in Book 3. So there are the guardians of the laws that we'll see. The guardians in the Republic, they were kind of in the early part of the Republic, and they were, uh, pleasure was banished from them. All of their material possessions were taken away. They lived in common. They weren't really allowed to have any pleasure because the idea of virtue was not really being instilled in that society. And that's why at the beginning of the Timaeus, which was the discussion that occurred the day after they talked about the Republic, at the beginning of the Timaeus, Socrates says he couldn't really see that society and that they talked about in the Republic coming into being because once you put these things in motion, once you introduce motion, and desires and spirit and all of these things, then things don't always turn out the way they do in theory. So I think the laws is maybe about turning theory into practice and being practical about some of these things. So we have pains and pleasures to deal with, and how do we practically deal with them? So Yeah, thanks. You raised some really good points there. Thank you. And we'll go to Phil.
Yeah, I think this is actually more understandable than the Republic because it seemed to me if you just train the guardians, then in a sense, the citizens are pretty much left to themselves. I guess they could be trained for a task. But it seems to me you have to also drive it down to each individual as an interiority that is expressed in the exteriority. Otherwise, it still it still would become something like the guardians are always like the sergeant yelling at you to do the right thing. And so, in some sense, but if you're self-directed, I mean, if all the citizens, well, maybe not all, but most of the citizens are self-directed, then they at least have a bit of self-control, and it's kind of important. There seems to be a realization of the physical versus the, I don't know if I should call it the spiritual or the mental, that in some sense that you have to maybe not eliminate the physical pleasures. I mean, I don't think you could quite do that, but you could certainly moderate it to a certain degree. And even in some sense, if you understand that, then in a sense, then you could even suffer a bit of pain or pathos to sustain the virtues that's inside, because I kind of think that the virtues themselves are a kind of derivative on a higher level. So, in some sense, there's almost a relationship, not only the diversion between the physical and the mental, or the conceptual, or the spiritual, uh, but there's also a separation between uh, time, something that approaches a kind of eternity versus temporality. Because the problem with pleasures are they're kind of pretty short range. You have some pleasure, it feels really good. There's no question about it. But in a little while, at least certain pleasures seem to disappear. Whereas like a virtue, they last a lot longer. I don't know if I would call it eternity. Uh, but certainly isn't it certainly isn't infinite, but it's quite sustaining that seems to hover over it. So I think there's a dimension about time and temporality as well as the conceptual versus the physical, and moderation. I think moderation is enough to have some constraint rather than say deny it altogether. I think that would not be sustainable, certainly for the general population, maybe for the guardians, but not for the general population. That's it, Phil.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I mean, yeah, the moderation makes me think of the idea of harmony, which has been discussed a number of times so far in our discussion on the laws, and bringing the system into some sort of harmony, I guess. And I really like the way you pointed to the fact that pleasure can be very short-lived, and it's harder to think about the long-term consequences in time. So the leaders who understand the longer term consequences are the ones who are going to be able to harmonize the society better. And so I think we'll see in the laws a series of offices being set up in this colony that will help to ensure some sort of social harmonization. I
Well,
like the way to, yeah.
but even in terms of pleasures, they're short lasting, but in some sense, that's even extended that you have to hope for more of it later. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like, so
Yeah.
so that's a conceptual thing. It's,
Yeah.
it's not like, I just got to have one ice cream cone after another, after another, after another, till I'm satiated.
Yeah, no, and I think the way you said that, we have to maybe suffer to sustain some virtues. I think that's an interesting idea of, giving up in the short term so that we can benefit more in the long term. So I think that was a really powerful idea. Well, thank you for that. I'll go ahead and read the next selection that I have, which is 635A to 635D. This is the idea of enslavement by pleasure. So Clinias starts this particular section. He says, "So be it. Don't hesitate to criticize our laws. There's no disgrace in being told of some blemish. Indeed, if one takes criticism in good part, without being ruffled by it, it commonly leads one to a remedy." The Athenian responds, "Splendid. But our criticism of your laws is not what I propose. That can wait until we have scrutinized them exhaustively. I shall simply mention my difficulties. Among all the Greek and foreign peoples who have come to my knowledge, you are unique in that you have been instructed by your lawgiver to keep away from the most attractive entertainments and pleasures, and to refrain from tasting them. Yet when it comes to pains and fears, your legislator reckoned that if a man ran away from them on every occasion from his earliest years, and was then faced with hardships, pains, and fears he could not avoid, he would likewise run away from any enemies who had received such a training, and become their slaves. I think this same lawgiver ought to have taken this same line in the case of pleasures too. He ought to have said to himself, if our citizens grow up without any experience of the keenest pleasures, and if they are not trained to stand firm when they encounter them, and to refuse to be pushed into any disgraceful action, their fondness for pleasure will bring them to the same bad end as those who capitulate to fear. Their slavery will be of a different kind, but it will be more humiliating. They will become the slaves of those who are able to stand firm against the onslaughts of pleasure and who are past masters in the art of temptation, utter scoundrels sometimes. Spiritually, our citizens will be part slave, part free, and only in a limited sense will they deserve to be called courageous and free. Just consider this argument. Do you think it has any relevance at all? Clinias responds, yes, I think it has at first blush. But it is a weighty business, and to jump to confident conclusions so quickly may well be childish and naive. So that's kind of a following on to what we just talked about in terms of not becoming a slave to pleasure. And I thought it was interesting the words in this part that says their slavery will be of a different kind, but it will be more humiliating. They will become the slaves of those who are able to stand firm against the onslaughts of pleasure and who are past masters in the art of temptation, utter scoundrels sometimes. I think this means maybe that, these scoundrels are either liars or cheats or tyrants who induce people with pleasures to do their bidding. And I think we see examples of this today, and we've seen examples of this in history. This is something that would need to be especially cautious about. Michael, your thoughts?
Just a quick observation, and this passage kind of made me think about some of the contrasts historians have noticed between the way business corporations would conduct themselves in the 19th century versus recent decades. There were a lot of corporations that would use suffering, threats of punishments, the state's use of the poorhouses to force people to work long hours for low pay for the corporations. But I think, I spent many years living in Silicon Valley in California in the United States. And one of the things I noticed is lots of overworked, stressed out people, but they would talk about how their work environments had, a free foodie bar and a hairdresser and a massage parlor. And I was sort of thinking, that's interesting that there's been this shift from using the stick to using the carrot, even though it's not totally clear that the goal has changed. And there's a famous story that was shared amongst a lot of us down when I was down there about somebody who had a leading chef at the Facebook campus show up at his house to ask his spouse for recipes so that when he was working 18-hour work days, the chef could make some home cooking for him to make it more palatable that he would remain at his office. So I think that is the kind of practice that Plato's having his characters anticipate here, that yes, pain is a major source of motivation and fear in human life, but so is pleasure, and both pain and pleasure to excess can cause enormous problems.
Yeah, really good example. And I wonder too, this search for pleasure, whether it, especially if pleasure is defined as something that's individually, the feeling of happiness. That quote of, I think it was George Washington that or the quote of the Jeffrey Rosen who wrote that article. The feeling of happiness, I think, is how we define pleasure now, maybe, but in times past, it was more the common virtue. And so I guess in this pursuit of pleasure now, does it also lead to unexamined lives? And, is this sort of we just, as you say, we work 18-hour days, we have a little bit of pleasure in the 18-hour days, and then we do the same thing the next day and the next day and the next day. And where is there examination of life in there, I guess? So really interesting example. Thank you. We'll have Phil and then Darren.
Yeah, this gets back to the idea of time and temporality again, because there's something very, very immediate about short-term memory. I mean, what's happening now? I mean, you're having the massage, it feels really good. And it just seems like when you're trapped into that, it's almost as if you can't see outside of the immediate moment. I mean, we're all trapped by that to a certain degree. I mean, after all, we all came from uh, an animal species, and that short-term memory is like you could hardly remember from one day to the next. I mean, I like that cooking metaphor, but one of my thought is like in the contemporary situation, I'm not going to blame everybody because some people are just so poor that they can't help but meet the needs for today. But I'm just so surprised that something like 60% of the people in America, which is supposedly one of the wealthier countries in the world, don't have like $500 or $400 for emergency fund. I mean, talk about a short-term memory, and talk about the games they play in terms of like layaway plans, pay now, we'll lay this away and you could pay later, or credit cards. We apparently, the public now owes something like $1 trillion more in debt, but it feels so good to have the pleasure right now. And completely forget, but I'm going to pay for it later. The only hope is that, well, maybe I'll die before I have to pay. I don't know how that goes. It just seems to me there's not the imagination to go beyond. And some of that is helped by corporations and the way things are treated, so that in a sense you almost forget about things because you only could think of, well, one day at a time, or maybe you could think about, well, the weekend, and that's it. And so I think that thing about time and temporality, like, yeah, I need that pleasure now, and the fact that, yeah, but things might be a problem, like you might get sick, you might get in an accident, and then suddenly you don't have the money, you have to borrow some more. I just find that kind of like, I guess that's part of the human condition, unless we are trained out of it. I guess we need to go into the brain and prune some of those connections away so that we could clear the jungle of immediacy in order to extend that out. So that's it, Phil.
I love that. The jungle of immediacy. Yeah, pleasure really kind of shortens our temporal bandwidth, which is a term. Oh, no, the name has just slipped me, but it's a term I heard some years back. And I think technology does this as well, where our focus becomes so immediate on that dopamine hit or something that we don't think about the long-term consequences. So yeah, that jungle is it's an interesting thing to manage. And as you say, with all of these pleasures that consumption can bring to us now, we have really mortgaged the future. We have taken on this incredible debt which will never be repaid. I wrote an editorial about the US debt. Okay, it's $32 trillion now. How are they ever going to generate $32 trillion of free cash to repay that debt? Right. So the future has been mortgaged. And so it's brought some pleasures to today, but what are the long-term consequences of that? I think that's a key thing. So, and as you mentioned, when people have so little, when there's so much poverty, I think it can really lead to a problem with peace. And what they're trying to do here with the new Cretan colony is to create a colony that will be at peace, and there will not be these internal difficulties with some very poor people and some very rich people. I think this idea of creating this common virtue, this shared experience, I think could lead to peace. Where, as you pointed out, I think the disparities today with a great deal of people suffering and in poverty could really be a problem in that respect. So thank you for that. Darren.
So I'm gonna go out on a limb here a little bit because I feel like there's a kind of contrast between courage regarding pain and courage regarding pleasures. I feel like there's a contrast between what comes from outside us and what comes from inside us. I was actually just looking through a text trying to find like where I might have thought this from, but I feel like the discussion just generally at 633 to 634 and this whole section basically, they're going on an implicit assumption that when we fear pain, we fear, going into battle, something coming at us from outside. But the fear of pleasure is like somehow, or sorry, not the fear of pleasure, the fear of being tempted is something that comes from within. It's like an enemy we have to fight inside us rather than fighting something outside us. In part, perhaps because we're fighting something inside us because pleasure is something we're drawn to rather than, some spear heading towards us, which is going to come towards us and we have to face. Pleasure is something we're tempted towards. So we have to sort of fight an inner demon to not head towards it. I feel like it's implicit in these pages. So this actually ties to something James brought up, just one of his last comments about the unexamined life. So I wonder if there's again a kind of implicit critique of Sparta here, which I know, Plato does and throughout the dialogues, or Socrates does, if only implicitly often, which is that although Spartans have very well developed virtues in regarding to external things, like dangers and going into battle and all that, that they're lacking a bit of the internal or examined life or some kind of although they might appear very virtuous in, like, for instance, what this dialogue started with, the arts of combat and war, that somehow they might not have those developed for a world of peace or a community of peace, which requires other sets of training and virtues that they're kind of lacking in. And so one definite sign that this might be going on in here is that I was trying to find this a dialogue. I wasn't able to. If someone can, maybe they can enlighten us. It's definitely in this text though, in book one. Whereas Megillus, he jumps in and says, oh, Athenian, go on, because I've always admired how Athenians seem to be, he seems to be emphasizing like genuinely good, like they're authentically good people. They're not acting or pretending. To me, this was an interesting emphasis because, it's like the Athenians have a more, obviously, Plato and Socrates critiques Athens too, but we're talking about the sort of very generic contrast between Sparta and Athens. And Megillus is suggesting that they have some kind of like internal development, that when they're good, they're authentically so. And maybe in contrast with maybe something in Sparta where they might possess virtues regarding external things, but maybe they're rather undeveloped internally. So anyway, I feel like I'm noticing a bit of this, especially, in Megillus' response here and so on. So I just thought I'll bring it up. And maybe some of this contrast will be worked out later on in this very long dialogue too.
For sure. And that difference between the feeling within and the feeling without, I think is key. And that, I think, there's several references in the readings that I'll do today. One that talks, there's a few that talk about shame and cultivating the sense of shame or the understanding of shame so that you fear looking ridiculous or bad to your friends. And that's different from a fear of external enemies. So that's an internal fear. So I think that that's something that's very much on point here. I think the Spartan system is interesting. It reminds me again of what Phil said earlier about the guardians who would train these guardians? Who sets the base for the system in Sparta, like the base rules for the system in Sparta that are supposedly never going to change? And in the Republic, who would have trained the guardians? Like, who is endowed with enough virtue at the very beginning to train these people to be virtuous forever? It's a difficult thing. So thanks for raising that, and it definitely will take us into some of the next readings. So, and Phil, further thoughts?
Just a quick comment. Yeah,
Yeah.
I like what Darren said about within and without. By the way, you made a kind of a pun because the training. Well, I'll just say my piece first. It needs to be driven all the way down to the individual because the war is within yourself for the pleasure and for the ability to sustain that over time. But you made kind of a accidental pun when you said the training within versus the training without. But the training within is, in a sense, also to train yourself to go without. I don't think you meant that, but it's like that's kind of interesting. That part of the inner is to be without. That's partly without the thing that you need, but outside it's not without. That's also a training for harmonizing with the people outside as well. But I like the way you accidentally said training without things that you think you'll need immediately.
Yep, I like that. Yeah, thank you. Darren, and then I'll read the next section.
Oh, okay. I was very excited. I finally found this passage I was looking for. I thought it was much earlier in the text, but actually it comes later. So I'll just read this. Like, this is what Megillus says after the whole discussion about, courage and education and training. So he does say this. So this is 642b, where he talks about how he represents Athens in Sparta. It's one of these institutions where, each of these city states have representatives in the other states. And he says here, it is commonly said that when an Athenian is good, he is very, very good, and I'm sure that's right. They are unique in that they are good not because of any compulsion, but spontaneously by grace of heaven. It is also genuine and unfeigned. So you're welcome to speak as long as you like, as far as I'm concerned. So, so this is an interesting bit of segue, right? Like, and I feel like, again, so I'm not going to reiterate myself. I just feel like it touches on that theme I was saying about how he was a Spartan, Megillus, who's like looking up to this Athenian is almost in an all like way. Like they somehow managed to be good, but not because they're being forced to, or it says compulsion here, but spontaneously, and it's genuine, it's unfeigned, and he seems almost like in awe at this. So I feel like there's some Sparta versus Athens thing going on here, which may reduce to a kind of war versus peace thing as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Actually, it's I had forgotten about that, but it's almost this jealousy of the Spartan for the Athenian system, and it makes you and it makes you think about, once societies are set up, there are jealousies inside societies and between societies. And so maybe that's an interesting little demonstration of these motivations of citizens that constitutions have to deal with and cannot be forecast. But there has to be some base virtue to be able to deal with that sort of issue, because people will have different feelings about these things. So,
and just very quickly, I wonder, like, this dynamic between the Spartan and Athenian, I wonder if it's going to keep carrying on in the rest of this very long dialogue. So maybe something to keep an eye on too. So just throw that in there.
Well, it's great. Thank you. Yeah, let's do that, actually. Since you brought that up, I think that's an important point that we should keep an eye on. So I'll just move to this next part, which is the second theme that I wanted to talk about today. And this is generally the theme of self-control. And this is from 636a to 637b. And the Athenian starts, "Well then, Clinias, and our friend from Sparta, let's turn to the next item we put on the agenda. After courage, let's discuss self-control. We found, in the case of war, that your two political systems were superior to those of states with a more haphazard mode of government. Where is the superiority in the case of self-control?" Megillus responds, "That's a rather difficult question. Still, I think the common meals and the gymnastic exercises are institutions well calculated to promote both virtues." The Athenian responds, "Well, my friends, I should think the real difficulty is to make political systems reflect in practice the trouble-free perfection of theory." Then there's a bracket. "The human body is probably a parallel. One cannot rigidly prescribe a given regimen for a specific body, because any regimen will invariably turn out in some respects to injure our bodies at the same time as it helps them in others." And he continues, "For instance, these gymnastic exercises and common meals, useful though they are to a state in many ways, are a danger in their encouragement of revolution. Witness the example of the youth of Miletus, Boeotia, and Thurii. More especially, the very antiquity of those practices seems to have corrupted the natural pleasures of sex, which are common to man and beast. For these perversions, your two states may well be the first to be blamed, as well as any others that make a particular point of gymnastic exercises. Circumstances may make you treat this subject either lightheartedly or seriously. In either case, you ought to bear in mind that when male and female come together in order to have a child, the pleasure they experience seems to arise entirely naturally. But homosexual intercourse and lesbianism seem to be unnatural crimes of the first rank and are committed because men and women cannot control their desire for pleasure. It is the Cretans we all hold to blame for making up the story of Ganymede, and Ganymede was a good-looking boy that was carried away by Zeus. They were so firmly convinced that their laws came from Zeus that they saddled him with this fable in order to have a divine precedent when enjoying that particular pleasure. That story, however, we may dismiss, but not the fact that when men investigate legislation, they investigate almost exclusively pleasures and pains as they affect society and the character of the individual. Pleasure and pain, you see, flow like two springs released by nature. If a man draws the right amount from the right one at the right time, he lives a happy life. But if he draws unintelligently at the wrong time, his life will be rather different. State and individual and every living being are on the same footing here. Megillus responds, well, sir, I suppose that what you say is more or less right. At any rate, we're baffled to find an argument against it. But in spite of that, I still think the legislator of Sparta is right to recommend a policy of avoiding pleasure. Our friend here will come to the rescue of the laws of gnosis if he wants to. The Spartan law relating to pleasure seems to me the best you could find anywhere. It has completely eliminated from our country the thing which particularly prompts men to indulge in the keenest pleasures, so that they become unmanageable and make every kind of fool of themselves. Drinking parties, with all their violent incitements to every sort of pleasure, are not a sight you'll see anywhere in Sparta, either in the countryside or in the towns under her control. None of us would fail to inflict there and then the heaviest punishment on any tipsy merrymaker he happened to meet. He would not let the man off even if he had the festival of Dionysus as his excuse. Once I saw men in that condition on wagons in your country, and at Tarentum, among our colonials, I saw the entire city drunk at the festival of Dionysus. We don't have anything like that. So I like that. That introduces the idea of the drinking, Darren. So you raised that earlier. So here's where I think the first kind of mention of the idea of this drinking and how it's outlawed in Sparta. And they're much better than people who allow drinking, is I think what Megillus here is saying. I thought it was interesting too, and I made a little footnote when Megillus says, none of us would fail to inflict there and then the heaviest punishment on any tipsy merrymaker. So we heard in Book 10, the capital punishment would be inflicted for the soul who refuses to acknowledge reason. And here I thought it was kind of interesting that the Spartans would apply the heaviest punishment on any tipsy merrymaker. So in one case, you have reason as the cause of a significant punishment, and here you have drinking as a cause for a significant punishment. I thought it was an interesting comparison, and I just wondered which punishment would be more fair in those two different circumstances. So any thoughts on this particular section? The making the political systems reflect in practice the trouble-free perfection of theory. So is it necessary to introduce some sort of system of exposing people to pleasures, but in a controlled way? Michael, your thoughts?
Yeah, this is a very dense passage, and I like that you started this with his remark that we were going to get to last session about the contrast between the aims of theory and the practical realities. And this is one of those passages where Plato has his interlocutors moving so closely to the historical circumstances that we're probably missing some of the nuances. So on that first page of the quote, when he makes the reference to Miletus, Boeotia, and Thurii, those are rival cities that were constantly in various states of antagonism with both Sparta and Athens. I don't know the exact specific conflict that he has in mind that's being referenced here, but I can very much see that what's driving a lot of this detailed analysis of different historical case studies is this broader context of Plato's virtue aims that are to bring together a unified society that can aim at common goals, common goods, and common collective problem solving. So whatever we think of the particular details, and again, we have to sort of moderate any judgments about the restrictive or permissive responses of the interlocutors to the concrete historical situations they're trying to address. They're not saying this is a one size fits all. They're saying, given these specific facts, here's some recommended policies. But I think we have to realize that the broader aim here is the recognition that stability is an essential political good for the future. And so self-control is really being enacted here as a common political reality, because without that, without some way of funneling our values and our passions and our conflicts into something that will discipline them for the common good, you simply won't be able to build a just society that will persist over time. And again, I want to come back to those Miletus, Boeotia, and Thurii. What was really significant about those city-states is they were constantly in moving between civil war, outright war with other countries, and subjugation. At one point, some of them were tribute states of Athens. At other points, they were vassal states of Sparta or of the Persians. So Plato is looking at this and saying, that's no way to live. And he's getting his dialogue partners here to really wrestle with, how do we get out of that kind of dynamic and into something more stable and long term?
That's great. And thank you for that history. I didn't realize that that was sort of underlying those three examples, I guess. I think that's important. And I like how you said that, stability is essential for the political system. And I think we have here an example of Spartan stability is based on rules, which are set and inflexible, whereas I think Plato is talking about a system that is flexible. So in the laws, there's that flexibility over time, right? So that part that I read about, sex between man and a woman to produce a child is deemed great, but homosexual intercourse is the worst thing possible. Like, who made up that rule and why? And why is that rule being imposed forever, right? So I think there was that example in there, and there's other examples as well. So yeah, I think it's that flexibility as well as stability. I think that is key. So thank you for raising that. We'll go to Phil and then Darren.
Yeah, what brought to my mind is a relationship between a kind of synthetic imposed law versus a kind of a natural law. And when I say natural law, I don't mean necessarily nature. I mean human nature that arose from nature in general. So there seems to be a hint at a kind of differentiation or even evolution, that somehow human nature pertains to nature in general, but it's also more specific. And I see it as kind of a balance, between a balance and a superimposition. A balance is to bring it in harmony with what is natural to the human nature. And superimposition is to suppress human nature so it obeys an external force that is continuous and obedient. So one of obeying and naturally being harmonized with it. So it almost seems like Plato or the Athenian is saying human nature is kind of like, have you just strike the right tuning fork? The vibrations within the system were just like, oh yeah, that sounds right. Right? Whereas if you blow at the other guy with, one of those bagpipes, it's like, ah, yeah, it's inspiring maybe, but it's like, it's rasping. So I wonder whether he could find the natural striking of the right tuning fork, so everything just vibrates at harmony with each other. So I found that to be interesting rather than going to the extremes of turning everybody into a Manchurian candidate, which is going to create a kind of even a suppression that, in a sense, is going to be a tension at some point. If you don't hold that right, it could explode as well. That's it. So.
I like that idea of the tuning fork. I'd like to find that. I think that the world could use that right about now with all of this polarization. I think, find the right tune, the balance in between. I think actually that when you called it to attention natural, it reminds me again of Book 10, where it was said that the gods are not above nature. The gods are nature.
Yeah.
It's not that they are supernatural. It's part of the natural order of the universe. And so I think, yeah, to the extent that the human soul is part of that as well, I think, yeah, when you say that there's essential natural laws versus synthetic, and I guess the Spartan and Cretan systems are synthetic and they don't really pay attention to the natural system. So I guess, trying to naturalize is kind of the same as harmonizing. And that's, I think, the aim of this project with Magnesia. So that's great. Thank you. Darren.
Just an observation about this passage that we were looking at. Maybe it's obvious, but the thing that stands out to me, I mean, just coming back to this theme of theory versus practice, is I think it's the highlighting of unintended consequences for the things we try to do. Like any policy we think might be good, but if we don't think broadly, holistically, and if we don't think using the proper tools, I think, this idea is going to be coming up later about all the stuff about measurement and having a criterion and all that, then it's going to lead to bad consequences elsewhere, maybe just in general. Like I found these examples actually kind of humorous in a way, because there's this idea of like collective dining or something that came from earlier in the text, and here like the suggestion is it leads to revolution. And then right, and then the practice of gymnastics leads to homosexuality, which I mean, I don't know if there's supposed to be humor here, but I thought both examples kind of, amusing. But the humor is all in good fun, and it could just very well just maybe drive the point home too, especially if there's truth to both, right?
Yeah.
I can see how there could be truth to both, maybe. And just finally quickly is, yeah, the Spartan idea of like, the Spartan here saying like, we have no drinking in our city, and no drinking parties, and how they have the most severe punishments for this kind of thing. Well, I mean, I think this comes back to, again, a kind of highlighting of a maybe implicit contrast in this dialogue between the ways of force in Sparta, where to do everything by force, and maybe a counseling of a different way that is being presented here, but also maybe in a kind of rough contrast between Athens and Sparta. Although, of course, Athens is also, very imperfect, as we know. So, but there's a kind of rough contrast here, and Spartan represents force once again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like the way you focused on measurement as well, because we talked about that the last time. And the difficulty of measurement, especially over time, is the thing that constantly plagues us, right? And so that reminds us again about Plato's dialogue, the Theaetetus, in which the question was, is man the measure of all things? And I think we see consistently, and maybe this is an example of Sparta is being held up as an example of a little bit of mismeasurement, maybe, of people's tendencies. Especially when you said there was that jealousy between Megillus and the Athenian. So did the founders of the Spartan constitution measure that tendency of the human citizens correctly? So an interesting idea. And yeah, the unintended consequences is something hard to prevent.
Add something very quickly.
Yeah.
So regarding what you said about this jealousy and this dynamic again between the Athenian and the Spartan. So at the very end of the passage you read, I love how like the text is there. At least my text there is italicized. He says, "We don't have anything like that." So it's like I'm sensing some kind of tension here between, and then of course, if you keep reading, the Athenian is going to point out the easy virtue of Spartan women. So
Yeah.
I feel some tension here.
Yeah, I would have included that part about the easy virtue, but I was running out short of space in my notes. So yeah, that was an interesting rejoinder. So thanks. We'll go to Michael and Phil and Brian, and then I'll read the next section.
I just wanted to make one quick observation before we move off this passage, which is the emphasis on past tradition and the way that it functions as an authority. In past Plato's pod dialogues, we've had some conversation about the ways in which, say, in Book 10 of the Laws, Plato does not seem to adhere to a notion of the separation of church and state. He very much mingles debates about religion with debates about state policy. And I actually think this is one of many reasons why is he's having his characters sort of observe that the laws and policies that exist in a given society at a given time are a product of the long wait of the history that preceded them, which will include culture, which will include rituals, which will include religious beliefs and moral beliefs and tribal segregations and all kinds of other realities. And so rather than saying, well, there are some things that have influenced the way we think and the way we construct our societies, but we're just not going to consider them because we have this wall of separation. What Plato is sort of saying is to create justice, you have to bring everything into the conversation and analyze it. And of course, he's doing it here from a critical standpoint. He's not saying, oh, yeah, we have to take the religious and cultural beliefs as we find them and just accept them. No, he's saying we have to critically examine the merits of these and see what problems or goods they have created for the society, but we can't take the tradition just as a blind inertial force that we can't critique.
Yeah, I like that the use of the word inertia, that overcoming that inertia, I guess, is the project that they're trying to do here with the new colony. And as you said, the laws can become the product of the weight of history that preceded them. I really like that line. In fact, there was a part in, I think, was it in book one? We covered it. I know it's in our reading that we've done so far, but there was a part where the Athenian is saying, well, at one particular time, the lawgiver thinks that they need a law for heirs and heiresses. And at another time, they think they need a law for something else. And again, where is the stability over time, right? We are these time-bound beings, and we're looking for some timelessness, and we're not finding it in our laws. So I think this is maybe what the aim is here. So thanks for that, Phil, and then Brian.
Yeah, I just want to say some more about the tuning fork idea now, because now I recall how I got this metaphor from long time ago when I was still in college. I remember, I was pretty much into listening to music. I'm not a musician. And I was with a friend, I guess we went to an Indian concert, with a sitar. And she made a comment to me that really struck me, that was very interesting. She said the thing about sitar is that twang that it has. It's not like a twang of a banjo, but a twang. She said that feels like your nervous system. And then I listened to it again and I said, yeah, because the harmony is not only just in the music itself, but it actually gets into it almost seems to vibrate with your nervous system in a way. So there's something very deep about that thing that actually harmonized with the actual nerve impulses. That was kind of interesting. I thought that was actually true because when I listened to it, it's sort of in the background, but it's something that's cosmically consistent throughout the music. And it's like, yeah, if something could get into you, that not only the metaphorical relationship, the harmony between the instruments, but it actually gets into you, that in a sense is beyond your kind of almost consciousness, in the sense it's a harmony. That's something that I have some problems with in a way, because it almost seems like the internet the electronic signals in that, it's almost like an invisible version of a sitar, because when you're into it, you're not only trapped by the content, but there's something about the screen and the way it vibrates. It almost gets you into a subconscious level. So that could also be a very dangerous thing as well. That's it, Phil.
Yeah, it's certainly, and there are many concerns about technology and the way it's going. I like the way you actually presented that. As I was thinking when you were talking about the screen almost provides a different cadence to time for us and leads us in ways that wouldn't be natural. It leads us in ways that others have designed the algorithms to lead us in. And that can definitely be a problem. But as you say, there is harmony in nature. And I was thinking too, the brass bowls, I think the harmony that comes off those is pretty profound actually. And also the mathematics in harmony. It was Pythagoras, I guess, who heard the tinking of the blacksmith's hammer and realized that there was a mathematics in the relationships of the notes. So it's a very ancient idea, but something that is pretty fundamental and mathematical. And maybe this is part, we'll see there's a great section here that I want to get to, and I think we might have time today actually to get to it, about calculation. And I think that may be very important when it comes to harmony and understanding calculations. So thanks. And then Darren.
Oh, it was Brian before me? I thought.
I did see Brian's.
I was going to let you go forward, but
Okay.
it's okay.
Oh, okay. I mean, I just have a really quick response to what Phil said. So regarding the tuning fork and your comment, James, about music, this actually came up in the Timaeus, right? So Plato has this idea that the music is actually the proportions of music have something. I don't remember exactly. It was something to do with, once again, the reason that sort of is the basis of the universe, and like music actually. So he was criticizing the view that some people had that music was just actually for just for frivolous pleasures, but he was like, no, but music's actually way more profound than that, because it actually takes us to the ultimate reality of the universe, the patterns and the ratios and all that. So yeah, just thought I'd throw that in there. That's in the Timaeus, which we read last fall.
Thanks for reminding us of that. I had forgotten that, so thank you. Brian, did you have a comment, or we'll go to Fred? Or
well, I was observing that Socrates heeded the decency of conventions without policing himself at that level. And I'm just thinking, if he policed himself that way all the time, all of his energy would be going towards controlling himself. But he was known, for example, to partake in the erotic, but for him, the erotic was towards something higher. And he had a reputation for even being free among the beautiful ones around him. He wasn't policing himself to flirt or be playful that way. He didn't transgress decency at the same time, but he also wasn't policing himself that way. And I think that has him, maybe that's a consequence of knowing yourself, that life could be your teacher rather than the rules. So he's not punished into some form. He's heeding a higher form that he's toward. Another example I thought was when, he sometimes would, engage with the idea of rules of short speeches, but he would break those rules when he was overcome with inspiration of wisdom to continue on. There's a higher order that was natural, that was most important.
That's great, thank you. And actually, the long-windedness of some speeches that I remember, was it the Hippias? I think he called out he kept saying, "Don't be long-winded because I'm not going to listen to you." And then other times he'd be long-winded.
Protagoras, I think.
Protagoras, yeah, okay.
Pythagoras, yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. And then, when you mentioned Socrates controlling himself, I thought about the end of the symposium where he goes out and stands in the freezing cold all night long. And, that was a drinking party. So maybe that will bring us into the drinking party theme that we're going to see in the next selection as well. So thanks for that. Fred, welcome.
Curious side note is in respect to the notion of the resonance of the tuning fork and the blacksmith was mentioned. It kind of comes together in Handel's suite, where one of his movements has a pedal note, and it's called the harmonious blacksmith. And there have been numerous variations on that since Handel. And the anecdote is that Handel took refuge in a smithy during a rainstorm, and the sound of the hammer on the anvil by the blacksmith gave him the inspiration for his movement. I just thought it was curious that it kind of brings together both those threads.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. I haven't heard of that, but I've made a note and I will have to take a listen of it. So that's great. And actually, I remember hearing something or reading something, I think it was last week or two, there was a headline about some new pattern had been found in the music of Bach. And I know there's talk about how his music is particularly good for certain things like studying and concentration and focus. So it definitely does have this effect on us. So thanks. And then Darren, is it brief or
Yeah,
just
it's
waiting
it's
for,
it's brief.
okay,
Yeah, I
great.
know we should move on.
Yeah,
There's still so
yeah.
much to go to cover. But I just
Yeah.
want to, yeah, I really like Brian's comment regarding, Socrates' relation to social conventions, but how he heeds higher forms as well. And so it made me think back to those dialogues on virtue again that we read a long time ago, and how in many of those dialogues they always start with, if you guys recall, in almost basically all of these dialogues, they start with very conventional definitions, because Socrates is always asking for the definition of various virtues, like what is moderation, sophrosune, or what is courage and friendship. He's always wanting a definition, and they always start with the very conventional appearances of what virtue looks like. So I remember the one for moderation was like, their first definition that someone offered was someone who walks in a moderate pace in a very graceful way into the room or something like that. But that's so superficial, right? These are just appearances of virtue. But how by the end of the dialogue, they often show, because regarding each of these definitions, Socrates will always pose in every single one of these dialogues, but is that good? Is walking in the room in this way and being graceful and moderate and all these superficial ways, is that actually always a good thing? But by the end of each of these dialogues, we often find out how virtues, insofar as they are oriented to the good and not just following convention, can often manifest themselves in unconventional ways, in surprising ways, in unexpected ways. And so this dynamic is what I love about all these virtue dialogues, and that they start with these conventional, superficial, conventional things that of people looking virtuous, and then how real virtue can be very surprising and unexpected, and it manifests in maybe in the least expected way sometimes. But we know it's good because, well, we have access to this idea of the good.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. And it makes me think of when you say convention, this little paragraph here. And so I'll just read maybe part of this section. I had marked 638A to 638E, but I'll just read the second part of that selection, because there's kind of this assumption about drunkenness. And maybe that's kind of a convention that certain people think that it's bad and others will defend it. So I'll just point out, or I'll just read this short bit here. Where the Athenian says, I think that everyone who sets out to discuss a practice with the intention of censoring it or singing its praises, as soon as it is mentioned, is employing quite the wrong procedure. You might as well condemn cheese out of hand when you heard somebody praising its merit as food, without stopping to ask what effect it has and how it is taken, by which I mean such question as how it should be given, who should take it, what should go with it, in what condition it should be served, and the state of health required of those who eat it. But this is just what I think we are doing in our discussion. We have only to hear the word drunkenness, and one side immediately disparages it while the other praises it, a pointless procedure if ever there was one. Each puts up enthusiastic witnesses to endorse its recommendations. One side thinks that the number of its witnesses clinches the matter, the other points to the sight of the teetotalers conquering in battle, not that the facts of the case are beyond dispute even here. Now, if this is the way we are going to work one by one through the other customs, I, for one, shall find it goes against the grain. I want to discuss our present subject, drunkenness, by following different, and I think correct, procedure, to see if I can demonstrate the right way to conduct an inquiry into such matters as these in general. Thousands and thousands of states, you see, differ from your pair of states in their view of these things, and would be prepared to fight it out in discussion. I just read that little bit, and then I'll go on and read this next section here. This is from 639C to 640D, and they're setting up the idea of a well-managed drinking party, with the idea that the virtuous leader needs to keep his head among the pleasure seekers. So the Athenian starts, take any social gathering you like, which functions naturally under a leader and serves a useful purpose under his guidance. What are we to think of the observer who praises or censures it, although he has never seen it gathered together and running properly under its leader, but always with bad leaders or none at all? Given that kind of observer and that kind of gathering, do we reckon that his blame or praise will have any value? Megillus responds, how could it be when he has never seen or joined any of these gatherings run in a proper way? Well, side note, we know where this is going because Megillus has never been to a drinking party. The Athenian goes on, hold on a moment. There are many kinds of gatherings, and presumably we'd say drinkers and drinking parties were one? Megillus says, of course. Athenian says, has anyone ever seen such a gathering run in a proper way? You two, of course, find the answer easy. Never, absolutely never. Drinking parties are just not held in your countries, besides being illegal. But I have come across a great many in different places, and I have investigated pretty nearly all of them. However, I have never seen or heard of one that was properly conducted throughout. One could approve of a few insignificant details, but most of them were mismanaged virtually all of the time. Clinias responds, what are you getting at, sir? Be a little more explicit. As you said, we have no experience of such events, so that even if we did find ourselves at one, we would probably be unable to tell offhand which features were correct or not. The Athenian responds, very likely, but you can try to understand from my explanation. You appreciate that each and every assembly and gathering for any purpose whatever should invariably have a leader. Of course, responds Clinias. We said a moment ago that if it is a case of men fighting, their leader must be brave. Yes, indeed, agrees Clinias. The Athenian continues, and a brave man surely is less thrown off balance by fears than cowards are. That too is true enough, agrees Clinias. The Athenian says, if there were some device by which we could put in charge of any army a commander who was completely fearless and imperturbable, this is what we should make every effort to do, surely? It certainly is, agrees Clinias. The Athenian continues, but the man we are discussing now is not going to take the lead in hostile encounters as between enemies, but in the peaceful meetings of friends with friends, gathering to foster mutual goodwill. Exactly, says Clinias. But we can assume that this sort of assembly will get rather drunk, so it won't be free of a certain amount of disturbance, I suppose. Clinias says, of course not. I imagine precisely the opposite. The Athenian says, to begin with, then the members of the gathering will need a leader. Of course they will, more than anybody else, Clinias says. Presumably, we should, if possible, equip them with a leader who can keep his head, the Athenian asks. Naturally, says Clinias. And he should also presumably be a man who knows how to handle a social gathering, because his duty is not only to preserve the existing friendliness among its members, but to see that it is strengthened as a result of the party. Quite true, agrees Clinias. The Athenian says, so when men become merry with drink, don't they need someone put in charge of them who is sober and discreet rather than the opposite? If the man in charge of the revelers were himself a drinker, or young and indiscreet, he ought to thank his lucky stars if he managed to avoid starting some serious trouble. Clinias says, lucky? I'd say so. So I like that. To me, it's almost talking about the leader of the state in the sense of if the citizens are full of pleasure and merriment, the leader needs to have some ability to control the citizens, but also himself. And so I thought this was an interesting analogy of the drinking party, maybe to the state itself. So I'll start with Fred and then Darren.
I think this also relates to an earlier section, which I think we skipped over, 637B. I was surprised to see where that it says, the subject of this conversation is not mankind in general, but only the merits and faults of legislators. And so I had to step back and I maybe I misread this dialogue because I thought heretofore in this dialogue, these behavioral prescriptions were intended for mankind in general, or at the very least, the citizens of the respective city-states. So to what extent are these prescriptions intended for the legislators or leaders, or the citizens, or mankind in general?
That's a great question. Thank you. And I'm looking for that part in 637B. It's not hitting me right now, but I'm just
D is in Delta.
Oh, D. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. The subject of this conversation is not mankind in general, but only the merits and faults of legislators. In fact, there's a great deal more we ought to say in this whole subject of drinking. It is a custom of some little importance and needs the legislator of some skill to understand it properly. Yeah, I think I see this dialogue as dealing both with legislators and with the citizens in terms of self-control. And it makes me think of where we ended the last session talking about education and the need for people to learn virtues so that they can govern or be governed as justice demands. So some people will rise to the position of legislator, others won't. But we need to prepare people for either role. I think that's the way I understand it, if that's helpful. Well, thank you for the question. And Darren, and then Phil.
So this is like my favorite stretch of this book one so far, at least. There's just so much packed in here. I'll just maybe mention one or two things. First off, like I love Megillus, who of course has never been to drinking parties because, as he said, they've been completely outlawed in Sparta, and he poses the question like about how can he be informed about what the proper features of drinking parties are. Which is such a funny question, and only someone who's probably maybe never been to a drinking party would ask what a proper feature of one is, because I think there's supposed to be informal occasions. I think there's supposed to be humor there because he's completely ignorant of what these are. And then and I just really love the, like, I think a crucial point here, which is that in order to understand any institution, though here to use an example of drinking parties, you have to understand them in a kind of in their proper functioning, when they're working properly. If you've only seen like drinking parties that were, I don't know, that ended up in fights or riots or whatever, then of course you're gonna think they're all bad. But the lesson here is that you can apply this to any institution. If you see them in their corrupt form and think that's like all they ever look like, and that's all they look like, then of course you're going to think, they're bad. But this comes back to this idea that came up last week, and I think it's in this week's reading too, between the difference between a relative kind of measurement, which is like literally just what you see in front of you and just comparing there, versus like ideal form of measurement. So you have to understand institutions in their best in their proper or best functioning form. And so the example I want to bring up, I feel like this is so pertinent today, is all the debates we have about democracy. So people say like democracy is terrible, we might as well just have an authoritarian govern everything. But of course, they're looking at like real world, extremely corrupt, not even very democratic examples of democracy as how like democracy is the is terrible, is evil, is a worse system, makes terrible decisions. Whereas the point should be that, but that's the wrong way of maybe trying to understand these institutions and their consequences, because at least in the kind of political philosophy, we want to understand what these institutions could be at their best and then judge the real world instances relative to that. So anyway, I just thought like, although they're using maybe almost even a kind of humorous example here of having all this discussion about political philosophy, but they're going to focus on drinking parties. But I think there's clear lessons to be drawn for methodology in political philosophy and political theory in general here. I think this is a very important example.
That's a really good, I like the way you said that the drinking party is maybe a bit of a metaphor for any institution, but it's a fun metaphor. I recall in a previous session, actually, you said that it's very dangerous to mix metaphysics with politics. And so maybe this is a good way to introduce people's behavior into people's motivations into the political discussion. It makes me think too about that wonderful scene at the end of the symposium where Alcibiades, the leader, the general, the big, he bursts into the scene completely drunk and out of control and expresses his love for Socrates and goes on. And it's funny because that was an example of somebody who attends a drinking party and doesn't keep his head, and yet he was a leader. So maybe that's part of what they were trying to say there. So thanks. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah. Phil.
Yeah, this really goes along with what you said, James, about education. This really gives me a clue of how the guardians are educated, as opposed to a little confusion, in the Republic, because it arises in general so that the ones that are being ruled or governed, maybe I shouldn't say rule, governed, and the leader arise from the same thing, and you could see the meritocracy. And I'm going to go back to my metaphor about music again. The conductor, like Leonard Bernstein, went to, Curtis, like every other musician. He knew when he got into what conducting, he already know music. In other words, he didn't come off the street and start conducting, and everybody respected him because he arose from the training and he understood music. And all the people who play in the orchestra also understood music, so they harmonized. Imagine if you got a bunch of bozos who think they're really good musicians, and he's conducting, and they're not paying attention, they're obeying because they don't respect it, because they don't know what a leader is. There would be a problem, not because of conductor, but because the musicians don't understand the relationship of the leader who actually understands that, and they understand that he understands it. So there's a harmony going on. So because he knows what a piccolo should sound like, and in relationship to a violin and so forth. And so I think the fact that they also grew up together, I don't mean they went in the same room, but they all went through this sort of training. They have mutual respect for each other. Then in a sense, they could even converse and they understand each other rather than say, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. So I think this is really a good relationship between the leader and the followers, because they all know the same structure and the same system and the same excellence within that in order to produce a good thing. So this is a good metaphor for governing the whole city or the whole civilization. It's just a metaphor, but it remains that the leader should have the respect, and the leader should also have the respect for the people who are paying attention to the leader.
Yeah.
So he tells you, hey, maybe cool a little bit about the drinking, you understand what he's talking about. All right, that's it.
That's great. I love that metaphor. Thank you. Yeah, the metaphor of a symphony being like a government organization, and each player in the symphony has to harmonize with the leader, but the leader needs to harmonize with the players. And that's, I think, the benefit of this instilling virtue in the Constitution, where they're all understanding that there is this common good. It reminds me of that great line in Book 10 that says, you don't understand that the universe doesn't exist for your sake. You exist for the sake of the universe. And the fact that you are contributing to the whole is good for you as well. So I think that's was an important line in Book 10 that I'd like to keep echoing throughout this. But I think what you talked about too, as I thought about that disorganized symphony, I'm thinking about a lot of governments around the world now, where anybody can get put into office without really any qualification or even basic understanding of how government works. And we're seeing the consequences of this incredible mediocrity through the world, I think, and we deserve better. And it's not just we deserve better, the voters, it's the children and the future generations who deserve better. We need to set an example, and we're not setting a good example.
Well, it's not what you know, it's who you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I'll take Michael and then Darren.
Just a quick follow-up to the comment you just made, James, about leaders who are not reasonably virtuous or competent for the offices they serve in. We can actually go a step further than that and talk about whether the voters themselves are reasonably virtuous and competent for the things they're voting on. The philosopher Jason Brennan has a really nice argument where he says that people have a right to an informed electorate. And what he's getting at is that if I'm going to be subject to leaders or policies that are determined by an electorate that does not sufficiently understand those policies or has sufficiently vetted those leaders or is virtuous enough to discern good leaders from bad, good policies from bad, that's bad for me. And so he argues that the only constructive way to think about elections is to start from the standpoint that every citizen has a right to an informed electorate. And if the electorate is not sufficiently informed, then the vote is not justified. I think it's an interesting position that sort of stands in between Plato and I would say most modern liberal democratic rhetoric.
Yeah.
Just wanted to add that.
That's great. Thank you. And yeah, definitely we could be subject to the tyranny of misjudgment of the voters if they are led by pleasure. And I think that's what's happening a lot in these, so we see these absolute appalling displays of political, they call them rallies. Could be maybe cult gatherings is more like what it is now. And the people attending them are led on by the pleasure of the absurd, inflammatory things that are said. It's a temporary pleasure. It's not a long-term pleasure, but it's leading them in a direction that is not sustainable. So I think that's it's something very relevant, I think, to what's going on now. So thank you for raising that. We'll go to Darren, and then I'll read the next section.
Yeah, if no one else wants to comment in this section, then just I guess one more observation about this. As I said, I just really like this stretch of text here. So yeah, this comes back to that the leadership and the role of the leader that we've been discussing. And I just like, maybe this is a bit obvious, but like I like how it's suggesting that there is like, because the topic here is basically drinking, and so I think the lesson we can draw from it is that it seems like even drinking itself is not inherently bad and obviously not inherently good. It's how, insofar as it is put under proper guidance and has proper leadership, that it could serve useful functions and it could serve good. I think at one point they were saying like if the leader promotes friendship between people or whatever. I guess that's something that drinking parties can do. And actually Kant discusses that too. Kant loves drinking parties. He talks about that as anthropology because he thinks it serves a kind of social function. So I guess like I would generalize this idea, and I think we can, just based on things that Plato says elsewhere, that there aren't any sort of practices, even drinking, that can't be that are always good or always bad. It depends on what kind of leadership, what kind of guidance or structures you're put under. So I like to think of this a kind of an ecological approach to practices. So a lot of it does depend on the context and the other people around us and the kinds of institutions and structures that we set up around all these things we have in human life, one of which is drinking. And that's how these things can be made good. So like the focus here isn't really on one person. Like it's like, oh, we need it's the institution of a drinking party, and it's the role of the leaders, and it's how all these things and how different people fit together. And I really like this. It's not like hyper individualistic, which I think is frankly like kind of unrealistic when it comes to virtue. Like people are just deceiving themselves if they're all just totally independent that way, and they all develop themselves that way. I think it's a bit of a stretch, but so I appreciate the sort of very ecological approach to virtue that we're seeing here.
That's great. And we won't have time, I don't think, to get to this last section that I had pointed out. But in respect to what you said, I just wanted to point out this is from 646D to 647D. This section here where they're talking about expectations in the context of drinking parties. And there was an interesting comment made that expectation is what we think of the future. So the future, the future is defined as expectations. And near the end of that section, the Athenian says, so this fear not only safeguards us in a lot of other crucial areas of conduct, but contributes more than anything else, if we take one thing with another, to the security that follows victory in war. Two things then contribute to victory: fearlessness in the face of the enemy and fear of ill repute among one's friends. And that was really, I think, one of the purposes of the drinking party, to see if somebody would bring themselves into ill repute. Certainly Alcibiades brought himself into ill repute at the end of the symposium. So one has to be both afraid and unafraid, is what they conclude. So, and I just have that part here on the screen. It goes on where the Athenian says, if we want to make an individual proof against all sorts of fears, it is by exposing him to fear in a way sanctioned by the law that we make him unafraid. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. And then just before we go to Phil, I just wanted to read it's a rather important section here that I wanted to just read. And we'll kind of end with this section and any other comments that people have. So if you can hold on, Phil, just until I read this. This is 644b to 645c. And this is where they bring in the idea of calculation. And maybe this is where we think of harmony and balance and all of this. So the Athenian says, here's a further point on which we agreed some time ago. Those who can control themselves are good. Those who cannot are bad. Clinias says, perfectly correct. The Athenian says, let's take up this point again and consider even more closely just what we mean. Perhaps you'll let me try to clarify the issue by means of an illustration. By all means, Clinias says. Are we to assume then that each of us is a single individual? Yes, agrees Clinias. But that he possesses within himself a pair of witless and mutually antagonistic advisers, which we call pleasure and pain. Clinias agrees that is so. The Athenian continues. In addition to these two, he has opinions about the future, whose general name is expectations. Specifically, the anticipation of pain is called fear, and the anticipation of the opposite is called confidence. Over and above all these, we have calculation, by which we judge the relative merits of pleasure and pain, and when this is expressed as a public decision of a state, it receives the title law. Clinias says, I can scarcely follow you, but assume I do, and carry on with what comes next. Megillus agrees, yes, I'm in the same difficulty. The Athenian continues, so I suggest we look at the problem in this way. Let's imagine that each of us living beings is a puppet of the gods. Whether we have been constructed to serve as their plaything, or for some serious reason, is something beyond our ken. But what we certainly do know is this. We have these emotions in us, which act like cords or strings and tug us about. They work in opposition and tug against each other to make us perform actions that are opposed correspondingly. Back and forth we go across the boundary line where vice and virtue meet. One of these dragging forces, according to our argument, demands our constant obedience, and this is the one we have to hang on to, come what may. The pull of the other cords we must resist. This cord, which is golden and holy, transmits the power of calculation, a power which in a state is called the public law. Being golden, it is pliant, while the others, whose composition resembles a variety of other substances, are tough and inflexible. The force exerted by law is excellent, and one should always cooperate with it, because although calculation is a noble thing, it is gentle, not violent, and its efforts need assistance, so that the gold in us may prevail over other substances. If we do give our help, the moral point of this fable, in which we appear as puppets, will have been well and truly made. The meaning of the terms self-superior and self-inferior will somehow become clearer, and the duties of state and individual will be better appreciated. The latter must digest the truth about these forces that pull him and act on it in his life. The state must get an account of it, either from one of the gods or from the human expert we've mentioned, and incorporate it in the form of a law to govern both its internal affairs and its relations with other states. A further result will be a clearer distinction between virtue and vice. The light cast on that problem will perhaps in turn help to clarify the subject of education and the various other practices, particularly the business of drinking parties. It may well be thought that this is a triviality on which a great deal too much has been said, but equally it may turn out that the topic really does deserve this extended discussion. Clinias says, you are quite right. We certainly ought to give full consideration to anything that deserves our attention in the symposium we are having now. So there was a number of points in that I thought were pretty important. Certainly the idea of calculation to judge the relative merits of pleasure and pain, to find the balance, I think is what they're saying there. And there was two references to really define what the law is. So it says, judging the relative measures of pleasure and pain, when it's expressed as a public decision of a state, it receives the title law. And then law is further defined, again, with respect to calculation. Calculation, a power which in a state is called the public law. being golden, it is pliant. And we talked about that earlier, about the flexibility of the laws. So Clinias and Megillus come from systems that are not flexible. And here the Athenian is talking about a system that has flexibility, pliancy built into its laws. And the laws are based on calculation, so that it's not rigid. It's something that's always calculated with reference to relative measures. So there's the theme of measurement that continues throughout this dialogue. So that's an important section that I wanted to make sure that we got to before we ended this. We have unfortunately about 10 or 15 minutes left. So much to cover, but I think we have covered a lot of ground today. So thank you all very much. And so we have Phil, then Darren, then Michael.
Yeah, this is a very important section. It actually tied through almost everything we read. Like, education is such an important part because it's actually the thing that restructures the structure of society. And the problem, and this reading, I particularly was focused on the gods and the string that's pulling the strings. Unfortunately, we now live in a society in which God is the mighty dollar. You can't have proper education if you're not willing to pay for it. I remember this very distinctly in, I think, 1983, or was it 1982, when I was teaching elsewhere and I went back to California, because that's sort of my home state in a way. And I remember Proposition 14, and people weren't willing to pay for the education. And that was the decision, and we get what we deserve. And I remember saying to them, it's simply a matter of time, the shit's going to hit the fan. And indeed it did, you know. So if we're not willing to pay for the education that sustains this thing, then God is not on our side. That is our secular God of the mighty dollar. So in some sense, like, yeah, we didn't pay for it. You know, all the rich people send their kids to private schools. The public schools no longer have the money to educate the people properly about how a culture works and the goodness of being human. I think, yeah. So, you know, you have to pay tribute to the gods if you're going to have the proper social structure. That's it, Phil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very interesting. The, worshiping at the altar of consumerism, I guess, is maybe not the best thing for the soul. Knowledge should be free. Personally, that's what I think. And I think Plato felt that too, that knowledge should be the product of the sophists. It should be free and available to everybody, or we become victims, of these people who take control of the system for their own ends, and we become powerless either in our role as being governed, or if we are lucky enough to get to the position of power of being the legislator. You need knowledge for both. So I think that's a really important thing that is missing or is increasingly missing maybe in the modern system. So thank you for that. Darren and then Michael.
I also really like this section. So there's two things I want to talk about. So the first is related to the calculation, and then the second relates to that puppet analogy, which is kind of cool. So regarding calculation, I just want to put like what we just read in the context of like the previous section we read about all the pointless ways of discussing and debating drinking and drinking parties, where he says like one side says it's good and another side says it's bad and it doesn't go anywhere, or like one side thinks like let's have a vote, which reminds me what Michael just said about voting. One side just thinks that more people agree with him, so obviously that's right, and then the other person brings up facts, but they're questionable facts. So here around and around we go. And so in that section, these are called like pointless procedures. So this theme of calculation is in the context of how to basically to be able to think about politics better and to conduct politics better and maybe conduct our discussions about politics better. So we're not just going back and forth in the ways that were humorously described in the previous section. So this is very relevant to today, like these sections together. And of course, he explicitly says this part is about, the correct way to judge the value of various practices we have. And so just maybe just a couple more quick observations about this theme. So first, I'll try to make this quick. So first is that another bit of context, which no one's really brought up, is the one of like really, really deep conflict and pluralism. So in the last section you read at the very end, he says thousands and thousands of states you see differ from your pair of states in their view of these things and would be prepared to fight it out in discussion. There's another section where he says justification only. So I think, yeah. Sorry, I just quoted this in my notes, but he says Athenian says justification. Only a god, sir, would be entitled to insist that this view is correct. There are so many conflicting opinions, but if necessary, I am quite prepared to give my own. So there's this suggestion that in the background of what is going on here, like I think it's interesting that the emphasis there is on thousands and thousands, which sounds like it's way more than even maybe he can actually count. So, but he does have this imagination that there are thousands and thousands and perhaps such states in the world, and that they're all going to disagree given the disagreements we already see. And so, like, how are we going to cut through this morass of conflicting opinions where people are, prepared to duke it out for? And of course, the conclusion seems to be, at least so far, I've only read book 1 again, I haven't even looked at book 2 yet, is calculation. And I'm just the second quick thing I was gonna say, I'm just gonna like mention this because I don't know what's coming up in book 2. I think there might be more, but it seems like almost a kind of proto-social scientific approach. For better or worse. So people might hate this, but I feel like there's a bit of a technocratic thing maybe going on here a little bit, because at the end of book 1, he's gonna talk about drinking as a kind of criterion to measure, to both a tool to cultivate courage and virtue, against against expectations. Drinking actually helps for that, but also a criterion for measuring so that you're actually accomplishing something. So again, this comes back to calculation. The background is like all these pointless procedures and debates people have, and also this kind of thousands and thousands of states is kind of like morass of conflicting opinions. What are we going to do about this? Well, maybe proto-social science. Okay, so and I also want to talk about, maybe should I come back after Michael? Because I do want to talk about the puppet of the gods, the puppet of the gods.
I think unfortunately we're going to run out of time, unfortunately, for that. But it's something that is it something that we could maybe explore in our next session, which will be on book 2?
Sure, yeah, we could. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let us do that if it's all right.
It is specifically about this analogy, but if it comes back up again, sure.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and that certainly was an interesting comment. And you talked about measuring each other, and I'll mention this very short bit right at the end of the book 1, 650b, where the Athenian says, in fact, I think neither the Cretans nor any other people would agree if we summed it all up like this. We have here a pretty fair test of each other, which for cheapness, safety, and speed is absolutely unrivaled. So this insight into the nature and disposition of a man's soul will rank as one of the most useful aids available to the art which is concerned to foster a good character, the art of statesmanship, I take it. And that's how book 1 ends. So this is the purpose of the drinking. It's a fair, cheap, safe, and quick test of each other. So thanks. And Michael, take us out to a conclusion.
Yeah, just quickly, I wanted to say, Darren, this particular analogy about the puppets of the gods will come up again. That's a theme that comes up and gets developed in later books. So we'll get plenty of opportunities to look at that. And I also wanted to agree with your comments and others that Plato really is perhaps the first behavioral psychologist in human history. The psychological acuity of this text, not just this chapter, but in subsequent chapters, is really astonishing. And I think there's a lot that remains true even with our advances in psychological studies today. The comment I wanted to close with concerns our long passage on page 9 about the role of the law. As James kind of brought our attention to, there's a real focus here of what is the law for? And I think this is a really fundamental question that we're wrestling with today. And I think one byproduct of our liberal democratic legacy is this belief that ethics and the law really have little to do with each other. They're just very much separated. They have that wall of separation between them. And I think what Plato is pushing us towards is not an identification of ethics and the law, because ethics is the practice of virtue. And it seems to me what he's arguing for here is that law is the cultivation of the conditions for the practice of virtue. So it's not the law is not the instrument by which virtue is accomplished. The law is the instrument that helps the citizens of the nation be virtuous. And so that allows us, I think, two really interesting potentialities here. One is to allow a little bit of critical distance between the law and our ethical practice, just meaning that we don't want to make it so that the law becomes invasive to the point of dehumanizing. But on the other hand, it allows us to have a much more robust conception that the law is here to help us be more than just free people. It's here to help us be good people. And I think that's an ambition and an aspiration that has really been lost. And I think that's what we should see at the heart of Plato's culturally encoded message here in this big passage by the Athenian, that he's trying to get us to envision a law that embodies the most noble aspirations of ourselves, so that when we find it difficult to do on our own, the law helps us to achieve it collectively.
That was wonderfully said, and a wonderful way to sum up, I think, book one. So thank you, Michael. It's as you were talking, I was thinking of Shakespeare's All the World's a Stage, and each one of us is an actor making our entrances and exits. And it made me think of the law as setting the stage in a way that's fair and equitable and harmonious for everybody, and allows any actor on the stage to find the path to the good. And that's the picture I had in my head as you were speaking there. So I think that was a good way to sum up book one. And we will, in 2 weeks, go to look at book two and see where that takes us. And yeah, I think we've covered so much ground today, so much ground, really. And I think understanding this idea of a constitution with cultivation of virtue as its primary element. And I think it's starting to give us a vision maybe of a very different organization and a more harmonious organization. So I wanted to thank everybody for participating. Phil, is it something that is just a moment or?
Yeah, it'll just be very brief, I think.
Okay.
I like what Michael said. I think if there's any shortcoming in this, is that it only restricts it to society. I myself would like to extend it back not only to human nature, but to nature in general, at least have some consideration for a greater ecology than just civilization itself.
Mhm.
That's it.
That's a good point.
Well, quite agree, Phil.
Thank you. So we look forward to reconvening in 2 weeks. I hope everybody can attend. And it's great that we've had some new participants today, and thank everybody for participating. Those who want to stay online for a casual half-hour unrecorded discussion in Plato's Cafe are welcome to do so now. Otherwise, I'll end the recording and look forward to seeing everybody in 2 weeks for book two of Plato's Meetup.